The town did not expect a miracle. It expected rain, a little relief from the long heat that softened asphalt and brought the smell of iron from the railway tracks. It expected the usual hum of late afternoon, motorbikes grumbling past the pharmacy, children racing plastic bottles along the gutter, a hawker calling mango, mango, sweet like Sunday. The town expected ordinary things, and for most of its people, that would have been enough. But in a house painted the color of wet clay, behind a screen door that stuck in its frame, a boy barely tall enough to reach the light switch began to speak about a childhood that was never written down. They said the boy was four, meaning small shoes lined up beneath a bed, crayon rinds in the corners like fallen petals, a cup left with a crescent of milk at the bottom. His mother said he had learned to read late, or perhaps early, depending on who told the story. His father said he did not read at all, only listened, and listening had opened a door they could not close. The boy answered to a nickname that sounded like wind skipping across a bottle mouth. He banged spoons on the table, climbed onto the counter to stare at rain beetles, dragged a blanket like a cape across the tiles. But when he lay down, when his breath turned even and his eyes found some distant point inside the ceiling, he spoke in a voice that was not altogether his. It was thinner, calmer, careful with words as if each one might land somewhere fragile. There had been no television the night it started. The power had stuttered and gone, the fan blades clacking to a stop, the heat pooling like water. The family moved into the patio, where the air was less heavy. Far off, a church bell shook itself awake. A prayer rode the street, brief and private. And the boy, who had stacked bottle caps on the sill and lined them up like coins, turned to his mother and said he knew a secret about the oldest child never named. His mother laughed, because what other response was there to something so peculiar? But the boy was unblinking. He spoke as a person describes a place they have visited many times, describing the smell of clay after rain, the taste of a fig split with bare hands, the way dust lifts beneath the sandals of a toddler who runs before he learns to balance. At first, they thought it was some echo from a Sunday story. The family attended services when the cousin who sang was on the schedule. They went less when she was not. The boy had a Bible of thick pages with rounded corners, colored pictures of men with beards and robes like soft sails. He liked the animals, the floods, the storms split by a raised hand. But nothing in those pages held the scenes he began to share. No scroll or verse told of a clay bird that beat its wings and left a crescent of dust in the yard. No author wrote about the small, sunburned boy who watched a moth crawl across the back of his hand and decided to follow it under the fig tree, where secrets gather like fallen fruit. And so the family listened, and fear grew like a vine up the trellis of their ordinary life, not toxic, but insistent, curling into places where light had once rested. Word travels differently in a small town. It does not march, it drifts, then settles in bowls and baskets, in barber chairs and checkout lines. By the third evening, the neighbor with the split thumbnail had heard. By the fifth, the woman who kept the key to the chapel had stopped by with a bag of guavas and a question that was not a question. By the seventh, the cousin who sang arrived on the stoop with a look that said this was either blessing or burden, and probably both. There were murmurs about the boy's dreams and whispers about the kind of attention that cannot be welcomed without inviting its shadow. Still, the mother made coffee, the father fetched extra chairs, and the boy was allowed to stay up later than usual, because if a door has opened in your house, you do not send it to bed before you learn where it leads. He did not speak like a preacher. He spoke like a child explaining the afternoon to someone who had never met an afternoon. He said there was a village pressed like a palm print into a hill. He said there was a house that smelled of wood smoke and wool, with a step worn smooth by bare feet. He said a little boy once chased the light that slipped through lattice and made squares on the floor, trying to trap it with his hands the way he trapped grasshoppers. He said the boy's mother hummed in a language that held more weather than words. He said the boy's father worked with wood until the wood felt like a quiet animal that trusted him. He described a cousin with a laugh like spilled grain and a game played with pebbles that clicked like tiny bones. He described the way the boy learned the names of the plants by the ways they healed. A leaf cooled fever, a root eased a cough, a resin sealed a cut. He spoke of fishermen who mended their nets under a sky that never seemed entirely empty, and of a teacher who traced letters in dust that the wind would later erase, as if to remind everyone that knowledge is something you must rewrite every day. He described bread that tasted of smoke and salt and waiting, and a shallow bowl dyed darker by oil than by time. When asked how he knew, the boy only shook his head, as if the question itself were heavy, and he could not lift it. Then he told a story his mother had never heard, and his father had no way to correct. He told of a winter with no snow, a winter measured instead in wind with teeth. He told of the way the boy pressed his ear to a wall at night to listen to the sea of sleep on the other side, wondering whether the people he loved floated there safely. He spoke of a lullaby about a shepherd who counted his flock again and again, as if numbers could keep danger away. He spoke of the boy's small jealousy of the stars because they never had to close their eyes. The first time he mentioned the name, he did not speak it all at once. He tasted it like a new fruit. He said a name that begins in the chest and ends in the breath, a name like a door that opens both ways. The cousin who sang put a hand to her mouth. The father set his cup down too quickly. The mother looked toward the kitchen as if there were a remedy she could fetch. Silence gathered itself into a circle around the boy. Outside, the bellows of night frogs made a simple choir. Somewhere a radio found its station and then lost it again. The boy blinked as if waking and asked for water. The circle loosened, but curiosity had found them, and curiosity is hungrier than fear. They began to gather earlier each evening, dragging chairs to the patio while the light still had color in it. They fed the boy soft questions wrapped in care, hoping to guide him without planting ideas. He would sometimes answer with a single image, a handful of words that landed with surprising weight. A wooden toy carved with clumsy patience, a strip of fabric dyed with indigo that stained fingers for days, a black-haired dog that slept with its nose tucked under its tail and dreamt of running, a taste of honey that arrived in a house like a brief miracle, held in a small clay cup. It was the details that made the listeners uneasy, the gentle clutter of a life that had, until then, been left to the imagination or omitted entirely. Skeptics came too, wearing their skepticism like a clean shirt. A teacher with a strict mouth made careful notes and asked questions about dates and customs, about the names of birds and the use of tools. A man who fixed motorbikes asked if the boy could know these things because he had once seen a film. A woman who read thick books asked if the boy might like to be on the radio. The mother became a barrier without meaning to, a shore against which so many intentions washed up and fell back. She guarded the boy the way a person cups a candle on a windy night, not to hide the flame, but to let it keep telling its small truth. Meanwhile, the boy's nights grew stranger. He woke with grit in his lashes, as if he had crossed a desert in the dark. He woke with the taste of smoke, with palms that smelled faintly of resin. Once, he woke laughing at a joke he could not explain. Something about a carpenter who measured a board twice and still cut it wrong because grief had made him absent. Another time, he woke crying inconsolable because he said he had watched a friend draw a circle around his own heart and promised to protect it, and the promise had felt like a fragile bridge over a rising river. The mother stroked his hair. The father stood in the doorway, hands gripping the frame as if to keep the world from entering too fast. It would have been easy to dismiss it all as a child's fancy, if not for the little convergences. The boy mispronounced a word in a way that happened to match an ancient dialect the teacher later looked up. He described a game whose rules the cousin found in a dusty book about childhood in distant centuries. He spoke of a well with 7 steps, and the mechanic, who liked to argue about everything, admitted there was such a well in a photograph he had once seen in a traveler's journal. Each coincidence alone was nothing. Together they braided themselves into a rope that people could not help but hold, if only to test whether it would bear weight. One evening, clouds gathered without committing to rain. The air smelled of rust and the skin of green mangoes. The boy sat with his knees drawn up, his hands cupping them as if they were small animals. He said very quietly that there were things not written because writing can bruise what it tries to keep. He said that a story is a vessel, and some water will always spill. He said there were days when the boy at the center of all their prayers tripped and skinned his knee and learned that pain is not a punishment, but a teacher. He said there were afternoons when the boy watched dust motes and understood that light loves even the smallest things. He said there were moments when the boy's mother looked at him with a mixture of awe and terror, because love that large is an ocean, and children can drown. The neighbor with the split thumbnail asked, almost in a whisper, whether the boy ever lied. The 4-year-old frowned in thought, the way elders do when asked to recall a date. He said there was a day when he pretended to be asleep so that he would be carried, and he felt guilty beneath the softness of his mother's grip. He said there was a morning when he took a piece of bread meant for a visitor and hid it for later. He said the feeling of being forgiven was like stepping from shade into sun in spring. These were not the answers anyone had expected. They were too ordinary, too human. And that is precisely why they struck the listeners with such force. If the story chose to pass through a child, perhaps it had also chosen the texture of truth that hides in small, undesigned moments. In the days that followed, something happened that changed the way the town breathed. A reporter arrived, careful with her smile, less careful with her questions. She had a voice made for the evening news and eyes that measured everything. She asked for interviews. She asked for photographs. She asked for access, a word that tastes different in every mouth. The mother stood her ground. The father studied the reporter's shoes as if the leather might answer him. The cousin who sang said, "Attention is also a kind of weather, and you cannot choose your seasons." The boy, oblivious to the storm he had called down, played with his bottle caps and made a city of them, a map of places only he could name. That night, the boy asked to go to the church. The chapel key-bearer brought the key on its long ribbon. The door grumbled as it opened. Inside, the air was cooler, denser, filled with the scent of old wood candle wax and the echo of every whisper that had ever been offered there. They sat in a pew halfway back, the place where anonymity meets belonging. The boy's feet did not reach the floor. He swung them gently. He looked at the crucifix and then away, as if looking directly were like staring at the sun. He said the child in his stories loved the taste of river water and the sound of saws and the feel of hair caught by fingers that were frightened and glad all at once. He said the child learned early that silence is a language too, and that sometimes silence tells the whole truth without words. Then he added something new, something tender and raw. He said there was a traveler who stopped by their house when the boy was little, a man with a limp that was more memory than injury. The traveler carried spices in a pouch and stories in his throat. He called the child a name from a place far away and laughed when the child answered as if to any name given in love. He told a tale about a king who left his crown on a stool in a fisherman's shed by mistake and came back for it at dusk. The boy mimicked the traveler's limping gait in the aisle, soft steps echoing like questions. He said the traveler taught the child a song with no words. He hummed it there in the half-dark, and the notes threaded through the pews like moths. The reporter recorded every breath. The teacher's pen emptied itself onto the page. The mechanic forgot to scoff. The mother watched the boy as if she were seeing a ship drift away from shore and could not decide whether to call it back or bless the journey. The father's hands, empty of tools, pressed against his thighs as if anchoring him to this moment, to this room, to this choice they would have to make soon. Outside, the heat broke. A wind came up, loosening leaves and tempers. Somewhere in that wind, a bell rang that no one could place. The boy shivered and his mother pulled him close. He whispered that the child in his stories once built a little bridge of sticks over a muddy rivulet and was proud when it held, then watched as the water rose and swallowed it, and learned that pride must learn to swim. Simple things, small things, threaded with a significance that made the skin prickle. He closed his eyes. He said he remembered the feeling of being expected and the ache of being just a boy anyway. The town would sleep badly with this new knowledge, turning it over like a coin whose metal feels unfamiliar but whose weight is correct. The reporter would stay. More neighbors would come. A priest would be summoned and would hesitate on the threshold for longer than courtesy allows. Some would say the boy had learned his lines from the air, that stories breed in the cracks of every house. Others would say that sometimes the veil between what we know and what we do not thins, and what slips through is not ours to categorize. And as dawn approached, the boy's mother would sit at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold, and she would listen to the quiet house, and she would wonder which is harder, believing or refusing to. She would lift her eyes to the door of her son's room, where a stripe of streetlight lay like a blade, and she would know that truths, like children, insist on growing. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a question would begin to build a nest. What do we owe a story that asks to be told through us? The answer would not come with morning. Morning has its own demands. Laundry, lunches, the predictable theater of getting a household into its day. But the boy would wake with a calm that looked like resolve. He would ask for his small shoes. He would ask to go out to where the old fig tree at the corner rises like a patient elder. He would ask to show them something that does not exist in any book, something he remembered with his hands more than with his mind. And the town, which had expected nothing more than rain, would gather again at the threshold as the boy stepped into the light that peeled off the leaves like silvery skin, ready to say the next unsayable thing. They walked to the corner as if the street itself might bruise, careful with each footfall, the way people visit a room where someone is sleeping. The fig tree held its usual parliament of birds, their voices small brass bells strung through the leaves. A stray dog decided to accompany them, alert to the change in the air that animals detect before we do, tail describing hesitant arcs. Neighbors slid from doorways, pretending they had other reasons to be on the sidewalk. The reporter kept a few paces back, her recorder dark in her palm, like a stone warmed by a pocket. The boy held his mother's fingers until they reached the hard dirt at the base of the fig. Then he let go, squatted, and pressed his small hand into the ground, as if asking permission. He began to draw with a twig. Slow lines, patient curves, a geometry that remembered a path before living it. A shallow channel appeared, weaving between small stones and roots that felt like sleeping snakes. He cleared a little dam made of packed earth and leaves, the kind a child makes when the world is measured in palmfuls. He signaled for water without speaking. The mechanic jogged to fetch a plastic jug from his shop. The label half peeled, the white turned a tired cream by sun. The boy poured slowly, letting the thread of water find its way, not coaxed, only observed. The stream slid along the line he had made, then hesitated at the dam and pooled into a miniature mirror that collected sky. He placed 2 sticks across the narrow water. They trembled and held. He tore a leaf and set it afloat. Everyone watched that leaf with a concentration usually reserved for instruments measuring the fate of engines. It drifted, caught, slipped under the bridge, emerged with a shiver of green. The boy looked up, and in his eyes there was a distance, a landscape no one else could see, the kind of distance a person carries after crossing a desert with water measured by sips. He said that long ago, in a yard stamped with footprints and prayers, a small river of this kind had been made, and a boy had learned that the world can be persuaded but not commanded, that patience is a stronger tool than force. It was nothing, yes, and it was everything. Children build such rivers every season, but the way he spoke of it, the way his hands hovered as if listening, made breathing loud work. The teacher removed her glasses and wiped them as if the world had fogged them with its strangeness. The priest, late but inevitable, arrived with the careful gait of a man approaching an animal that may bolt. He removed his hat, and the sweat ring remained like an eclipse. He watched the leaf circle the pool as if it were the hour hand of a clock that had decided to ignore time. The boy stood and patted dust from his knees. He said the child who built the first river had called it a path for stray light, because he believed light could be guided to places that forgot it. He said he did not learn that phrase from anywhere nearby. A hint of wind passed with a smell of iron and green mango, the smell of the storms that visit without staying. A neighbor who rarely spoke nodded to herself, the way people do when they recognize a tune played on a strange instrument. The reporter had what she needed and did not know what to do with it. A story is a meal you must season with risk. She could taste all of it at once. She asked for a meeting with the priest. He agreed because it was the kind of day when everyone agreed to everything. They walked back toward the chapel, an uneven procession. Mother and child, father and silence, priest and obligation, neighbors and the weather of their opinions. The boy dragged his finger along the stucco as they passed, feeling the grit, as if memory might have a texture that matched this wall, this color, this corner. Inside the chapel, the candles offered their steadfast language, wax, flame, small boldnesses that hold rooms together. The boy tilted his head and listened. Listening had become a way he moved through hours. He said there was a song that sometimes rose from the floorboards, a song made of steps and sanding, of wood turned into usefulness. He said the child in his stories liked to name the tools as if they were animals. Plane and awl and bow drill spoken with affection, as if words could soften splinters. The priest felt his throat tighten at the simplicity of it, love for the ordinary, reverence for the unmiraculous. It was disarming, because it asked no faith, only attention. In the back pew, the teacher ran her finger across the grain of the bench and thought of the written record of childhood. How so much of it is absent, as if children exist only as future or myth. She wondered what else had been allowed to evaporate from history, what else had fallen between the cracks of the official story. She thought of recipes never written down, of lullabies that were never recorded, of names of women who lit lamps before dawn and were thanked only by the small circle of their households. She watched the boy and felt, to her surprise, not fear, not even hope, but hunger. A hunger for the small truths that behave like seeds, insisting on becoming more than themselves. The priest spoke, not to the boy, but to the room, as priests often do when they need a witness larger than any one person. He said sometimes stories arrive like birds, following a line of heat across a valley, not caring who has prepared a perch. He said care must be taken, because birds can be startled into silence by too much looking. He asked the mother what her heart told her. She answered without words, her hand at the back of the boy's neck, fingers finding the soft place just above the spine, thumb tracing an arc that mothers have traced since before there was a language for comfort. The father stood apart, and in his apartness there was a storm. He had learned that hands are for holding, lifting, shaping. He had not learned what to do when the work is invisible. He felt watched by an eye without a face, like the sky when it waits for lightning. He remembered his own childhood, the way he had wanted to know hidden things, and how quickly adults had offered explanation, as if mystery were a fire to be extinguished with clarity. He was tempted to do the same now, to correct the boy's strange sentences, to usher him back toward homework and predictable toys. But the words did not come. He knew the feeling of wrong tools in the right hands. More days, more evenings. The story kept unfolding like a garment unrolled from a chest, revealing embroidery no one had ordered, but that someone had loved enough to make. The boy spoke of the child's friendships, the kind that do not survive official histories but leave marks anyway. He told of a girl who could imitate bird calls and taught the boy the difference between a cry for danger and a cry for rain. He spoke of a neighbor who limped and refused help, and the way the boy learned to offer assistance without naming it. He described a winter fever that left the child weak, and the way the taste of watered wine returned strength like a visiting cousin arriving at dusk. He remembered the smell of oil pressed on a headache, the way it warmed and then cooled, a small consolation nestling behind the eyes. He remembered a cousin's wedding where laughter ran like a stream through the courtyard, and how the boy sat on a step and studied the sandals of passing adults, learning from the wear where their lives had walked. He recalled a day when soft leather was cut and stitched, and the boy's fingers itched to touch but were taught to ask first, because respect is a craft too. He named a herb that grows between stones and once saved the neighbor with the limp from infection. The teacher looked it up, and there it was, an old name with a bitter coat, likely where the boy had no path to find it. Another small rope of coincidence, tugging. At the edge of all this, the town began to divide not into believers and doubters, but into those who felt the world breathing wider and those who liked its lungs just as they were. The radio made a feature. A man with a well-trimmed beard and a portable microphone speaking at the market, asking strangers what they think of mysteries that borrow children's mouths. The market gave him its fruit of opinions, ripened, bruised, tart. Someone said the boy had a gift, and gifts must be shared. Someone said the boy was being used by forces best left unnamed. Someone said if you fill in the missing parts of a sacred story, you risk mistaking your pen for a torch and setting the edges on fire. The mother began to dream differently. First there was the ocean, enormous and calm as a cut stone, with fish-like ideas moving beneath. Then a field of barley, gold, as the inside of a candle, each stalk whispering a different sentence, none complete. Then a workshop, air sweet with sawdust, sadness tucked under the bench like a spare plank. She woke with the sense that she had been listening to a language she was not meant to translate, only to keep company with. She began to hum more, without noticing, her hums catching in the boy's mouth, until he took them and carried them further. The priest made a decision to invite another presence, not to test the boy, but to companion the situation with formality. A letter went out, composed in careful words that asked for counsel without naming fear. A scholar would come, he decided, someone with the patience of a gardener and the temperament of a cloud. When the scholar arrived, wearing a shirt the color of rain and shoes that had known long hallways, the town adjusted itself again. She sat in the patio with her notebook and did not open it for a long while. She asked the boy about his favorite game. He answered, and though the answer was ordinary, it was the way he shaped the air around it that made the scholar lean in. She had listened to many tales. She knew when someone was inventing and when something else was happening, that slow river that moves beneath the visible one. She requested to sit with the boy in the workshop of a local carpenter to see how he behaved among wood and tool, to test for performance, though she did not use that word because performance is not a sin, but can be a trap. They went on a late morning washed with heat. The carpenter opened his drawers like a magician showing there is no trick. The boy wandered as if among sleeping animals indeed, touching handles, recognizing shapes his hands had not been taught. He lifted a plane, and held it in a way that made the carpenter blink. He did not pretend to use it. He simply knew its heft, as a person knows the balance of a familiar cup. He stood near the saw and set his palm on the bench as if greeting an old friend. He said the child he remembered liked to press his ear to wood to hear its argument and then choose which side to support with the blade. He said there is a sorrow in cutting, but there is also a promise, and wood forgives if you listen. The carpenter swallowed hard behind his mustache. The scholar opened her notebook at last and wrote not conclusions but questions, each one a small well dug to catch the next rain of words. By now, sleep for the family had become a negotiation. The boy woke at odd hours, speaking in a whisper, and then drifted off mid-sentence. The mother learned to keep a small lamp with a cloth thrown over it to make a private dusk, so his words would not evaporate in the bright. Once his fingers traced letters in the air, letters that meant nothing to her and everything to the teacher, who came the next day with a photocopy of an old script and a heart beating against the ribs like a bird against a window. Not from fear, from urgency. Another night he spoke of a small quarrel over a game of knucklebones, and how apology tastes like warm milk, soothing and a little heavy. These pieces did not add up to proof, and perhaps that was not their purpose. They added up to a life with its shoes off. The reporter grew restless because news requires shape, and shape implies an end. She pressed the priest to declare, the scholar to decide, the mother to sign a release. The priest refused the trap of certainty. The scholar placed her open palm on the table and said some things ask to remain questions, or they cease to instruct. The mother felt tired in her bones, a tiredness grandmothers know, and she asked everyone to leave by early evening so that the house could remember itself. The boy slept that night without interruption, and his rest felt like a benediction nothing had earned. Just before dawn, in the hour that thins the barrier between the world and whatever watches the world, the boy woke with tears already on his face. He walked to the window and opened it, not because the room was hot, but because something in him needed a horizon. He whispered that the child he remembered once saw his mother cry quietly behind a water jar, and learned that sorrow can be kept company with, if not solved. He said he remembered wanting to be larger than he was, so he could protect everyone, and the ache of discovering that love's math does not work like that. He said he felt small again now, and held out his hand. The mother took it, feeling the delicate bones as a cartographer might trace a coastline, discovering all over again that maps are not the territory. By mid-morning, a rumor had arrived that someone from far away was on their way, someone with a title many syllables long, someone who would either bless or bind. The town reacted like a body to a sudden chill. Shoulders rose, conversations shortened. The fig tree dropped a leaf so large and shining it could have been a hand. The boy sat on the step, toes nudging dust, and hummed the song with no words. The dog returned and placed its head in his lap. He stroked the coarse fur in steady lines, and the dog sighed, settling into that animal trust that does not ask for the future. The scholar proposed one more exercise, if it could be called that. She asked the boy to close his eyes and breathe the smell of the house, then tell what it reminded him of. He obeyed with the seriousness of a child given real work. He inhaled, and the air offered up its blend of soap, citrus rind, iron from the gate, yesterday's coffee, wax from a polished chair. He said it smelled like a morning when bread had been burned and laughter saved it. He said it smelled like a floor freshly swept in anticipation of a visit, like bread dough punched down by hands that had kneaded grief. He said it smelled like a small wooden box kept high on a shelf where the child hid a stone, a feather, and a promise. The scholar closed her notebook and did not look at her notes again that day. Some days the work is to hold a door. She stood and stretched, joint speaking, and asked the mother about soup. They ate quietly, the boy blowing on each spoonful as if warming it rather than cooling it. The father fixed the broken hinge on the bathroom cabinet because there is a dignity in continuing to do what you can do. The town held its breath and began counting, as towns do when something is coming, as if numbers could shepherd fate. Afternoon returned with its slow heat, with shadows that walked the walls like tired animals. The priest came with a stack of folded papers he hoped he would not need, prayers for clarity, for restraint, for protection from the certainty that breeds harm. The reporter hovered like thunder. The mechanic cursed softly when a bolt slipped from his grip and rolled to a place it would never be recovered. The teacher wrote a list of questions she would never ask aloud. The cousin who sang hummed under her breath, a thread through cloth. When the car finally appeared at the end of the street, it was not grand. Dust hung around it like an afterthought. The man who stepped out was not imposing, not in the usual way. He carried his authority like a man carries a sleeping child, carefully and without pride. He greeted the priest first, then the mother, then the boy, whose hand he did not shake but bowed over, as if to acknowledge that some hands are currently busy with work larger than introductions. He said he had come not to interrogate, but to listen. He asked for a chair under the fig tree. He sat. He removed his watch, set it on his knee, and covered it with his other hand, as if time should not be allowed to interrupt. The town arranged itself in a wide circle, respectful space between curiosity and intrusion. The man listened to the boy speak of small things, the bridge of sticks, the taste of a fig warmed on a windowsill, the way goats regard children as if children were interesting mistakes. He listened until the boy's voice thinned, then asked one question that was both gentle and piercing. He asked whether the child in these memories ever felt alone, even while surrounded by love. The boy looked at his mother, and then at the priest, and then at his own knees, scabbed in the usual geography. He said yes, the kind of yes that lowered the temperature of the day. He said being expected is a kind of solitude. He said loving everyone is exhausting when you are little, because everyone is larger than you are. The man nodded, as if a knot had loosened in a rope he had carried for years. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed as if breathing were a prayer. He said he had no verdict to deliver, only a suggestion. He said that where a mystery asks to be carried, it is better shared among many shoulders, lest the carrier be crushed. He offered nothing doctrinal, nothing definitive. He offered a way to keep walking. Evening stretched itself across the roofs with the elegant certainty of dusk. The reporter recorded an ending that was not an ending. The priest folded his papers back into the bag and felt lighter. The scholar wrote one last note and knew it would not make it into any article or report, because it was simply this: some truths prefer to sit with you rather than be displayed. The town exhaled and turned toward dinner, toward baths, toward the television, and its bright reassurance that somewhere else stories end with credits. The boy fell asleep early, before the insects had begun their sharp music. He slept with one hand curled around the collar of the dog, a small tether to the world. In his sleep, his breath counted out a rhythm that matched the swing of a carpenter's arm, the pull and push that makes rough edges smooth. His mother sat by the window and watched the street untangle itself from the day. She thought of the river he had made and the leaf that had trusted it. She thought of the bridge and the lesson it taught its maker when the water rose. She thought of the traveler with the limping gait and the song with no words that still threaded the rooms like a strand of moonlight. In the quicksilver hour before night concedes to full dark, a wind moved through the fig leaves with the sound of applause from a faraway crowd. The mother closed her eyes and let the sound wash her. She did not ask for answers. She asked for the strength to remain a vessel that could be filled and not cracked by the weight. Out in the road, a bicycle passed, its chain ticking, a small metronome keeping time for a town trying to learn a new tempo. In the morning, the boy would wake with a new image, one that would rattle the tender scaffolding they had built around this phenomenon. He would speak of a small accident, A cut, a lesson in mercy that lived in the body long after the skin healed. He would describe a moment that asked to be believed or turned away from. He would take them to a place where love and danger shake hands. And from there, the story would follow a narrower ledge, the kind where each step matters, the kind where looking down is not an option because the floor is too far to be useful. But that is for the next day. For now, the house breathed. The child slept. The town rehearsed the only prayer that makes sense when the world reveals a seam. Let me be tender with what I do not understand. Morning unrolled itself like gauze, thin, white, a little see-through, intended to bind something that had been opened. The first voices were the market sellers shaping their calls to fit the cool air, the syllables damp as clothesline. A rooster argued with a bus. The dog returned to the step with the certainty of a tide knowing where the shore is. The boy woke and lay still for a long breath, as if listening to a lesson arriving on slow feet. When he sat up, his hands went first to his palms, the place where maps sometimes appear for those who do not read with their eyes alone. He announced nothing. He simply stood and walked toward the sink, asked for a bowl, asked for a scrap of clean cloth, asked for the green bottle with oil that lives near the stove. The mother's shoulders tightened, not in suspicion, in recognition. This was the choreography of care. She brought the things as if serving a guest whose arrival had been foretold. The father watched from the doorway, his face carrying the late shadows of his sleep. The boy tested the edge of the cloth against his cheek, feeling its weave. He cupped water and let it fall, practiced rain into the bowl, a small rehearsal. Then he took from the table a dull table knife and ran his finger along the safe side of it, an action so ordinary that the heart did not flinch. Until he spoke. He said there had been a day when a child barely taller than the workbench reached for a tool he was told to leave alone. Not defiance, hunger, the kind of wanting that believes closeness is knowledge. The tool answered with a quick kiss of metal, a bright mouth across the pad of the thumb. It was not a grievous injury. The child had cried anyway, not only from pain, but from the sting of having failed goodness by such a simple misstep. He said the workshop smelled of cedar and patient sweat. He said the floor received the first drops the way dry earth receives rain, with a soft darkening that looks like comprehension. He showed them what happened next. He wrapped the cloth tight, not to choke the hurt, but to keep it still until breath could do its quiet work. He asked for the oil and dabbed the cloth's edge, and the scent lifted, green, ancient, the smell of hills where people have spoken to God in less than words. He pressed gently and held. The mother went very still, her eyes on the bowl. On the way, the water caught light and made it shiver. The father felt the ghost of a splinter in his own hand, memory answering memory like call and response. The boy said the child had looked up and met his mother's gaze, and in it found no blame, only a sorrow that was not disappointment, but empathy dressed in its working clothes. He said she did not ask why. She asked where. Where does it hurt? Where does it fear? Where does it hide? He said those questions were the first prayers he ever learned that did not require heaven to answer. He said a strip of soft wool was found, and someone spoke a blessing that sounded like breath learning to be calm. He placed the bowl on the table and reached for the father's hand, turned it palm up, studied the long, pale scars that work leaves behind as proofs. He traced one and told a story that did not belong to the father, and yet seemed to have always been waiting at the edges of his skin. A day when the child, older by the width of a season, argued with a cousin over a game of small bones, words becoming pushes, pushes becoming a shove with a stone behind it. The world went bright then narrow, pain blooming at the eyebrow, blood a warm stream that startled. He said the boy who had thrown the stone stood shocked into stillness, shame arriving faster than apology. He said the injured child reached for him, not to punish, not to demand repair, but to steady the hands that had forgotten their purpose. Mercy, when it came, did not trumpet. It settled like dust on a beam and changed the light. The mother's breath caught on a tiny hook in the throat. The memory did not require belief to press against her. It carried its own weight, like a folded letter that cannot be empty because it has survived so many pockets. The priest arrived to find them gathered around ordinary items, bowl, cloth, oil, as if around relics. He did not interrupt. He understood that interruptions, like loud shoes, frighten shy truths. News had traveled ahead of dawn, as it does when a town has learned the flavor of a story and refuses to forget it. Today, woven into the hum, came a new thread. A man in a crisp shirt with a camera small enough to pass for a toy, a voice that rose and fell like a jingle, had arrived with promises of reach. Not the reach of hands, the reach of 1,000,000 eyes. He stood at the gate and smiled with too many teeth for the hour. He asked to film the miracle. The mother drew her body across the doorway like a curtain. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said this house was doing something fragile with its air and could not spare any for performance. The man laughed the soft laugh of people who are paid to turn no into yes. The priest's shadow lengthened in a way that suggested the conversation would end soon. The boy was already elsewhere, walking toward the alley where the carpenter's shop leaned its shoulder against a wall bleached by years. He stood in the open doorway and inhaled as if scent could tell time. The carpenter, who had learned to nod rather than ask because questions shape answers in their own image, offered the bench with a gesture. The boy did not climb upon it. He rounded to the side and placed his hands on the soft wood edge, palms flat, a posture with 100 uses: prayer, promise, apology, beginning. He said the child had loved offcuts more than perfect lengths. He said scraps taught you how generosity works, how grace finds the part of you that forgot it fits somewhere. He picked up a shaving that curled like a paper river and held it against the light, watching the sun make a thin wafer of it, almost edible, an amber language. He set it down as if returning a baby to its bed. He spoke of a day when a beam was too long, and impatience was the hidden tool that spoiled what real tools might have made right. He told how the father's jaw set like a clamp and then loosened like rope, how a hand ruffled hair instead of striking, how a lesson was carried in silence and patience, heavier than wood. A cluster of neighbors leaned in the doorway, hunger and carefulness doing their old dance. The scholar took the corner nearest the light. The reporter with the evening voice hovered outside the window, her equipment asleep. The influencer with the small camera had retreated not because he accepted defeat, but because he understood strategy. He would find another angle, another neighbor willing to speak into his manufactured intimacy. The boy ran his finger along a knot in the grain and smiled the small animal's smile of discovery. The knot was a memory of a branch that once reached, now swallowed into utility. He said the child liked knots. Imperfections give a thing something to say other than its purpose. Back home, the mother found a streak of blood on the sink. It was the thinnest line, like a thought the mind rejects before fully thinking it. She cleaned it with the care of someone erasing a curse. The cloth in the bowl had turned the water a shadow blue. She carried the bowl to the fig tree and poured it at the roots, a private libation, and the tree took it without ceremony, as trees do. By midday, the town had shifted into its different mode, the one where heat asks you to be deliberate and shadows ask you to move inside them like tunnels. The boy asked for figs. The mother chose 2 and let them ripen in her palms for a breath. He ate one standing, juice traveling his wrist. He pressed the other into the priest's hand. A fig given is a complicated gift. It says, "I see you." It says, "This sweetness is not mine alone." The priest had no appetite but ate anyway, reverence being sometimes obedience to another's generosity. The scholar suggested a walk. No destination, just the world as it presents itself when not asked to prove anything. They moved through streets the boy knew by the taste of their dust. He named small things: the cricket that had chosen a crack near the blue door, the cat that slept on the warm engine of the baker's car, the piece of sky caught permanently in a puddle shaped like a foot. He stopped outside the pharmacy and pressed his palm to the glass, where bandages stared blankly from their shelf. He said the child once hated bandages because they looked like surrender. He said later he loved them because they were confessions of having lived. Near the end of the street was a wall stained with rust. On that wall, someone had drawn years ago a pair of wings in chalk, the kind people stand between to pretend. The chalk had been refreshed by a dozen hands over time, until the wings were a palimpsest of intentions. The influencer found them and coaxed a teenager to stand for his camera, to stretch her arms, to turn her head so the light caught her, to repeat the laughter until it sounded spontaneous again. The boy watched and whispered that play is sacred when it forgets the watcher, and selling it back to itself is a kind of theft. He did not say it like a condemnation. He said it like a sorrow. They reached the end of the pavement and followed a track that used to be a path for animals. The air changed, the smell of clay stronger, a sweetness from something flowering out of sight. The boy crouched at a tuft of herb with tiny white petals, no larger than a newborn's fingernail. He did not pick it. He spoke its use in fever without naming it, because names can be traps, and he seemed to know not to furnish the world with too many hooks. The teacher, walking behind, felt the familiar tug to look it up, to confirm that surprise with footholds. She let the tug pass. Facts could wait. Presence could not. At a bend in the path, the ground fell away into a shallow bowl. A dry cistern lived there, ringed with stones placed by hands that had never imagined this day. The boy stopped so suddenly, the dog bumped his calf and apologized with his eyes. He tilted his head as if a far bell were trying to be heard. He said, "There had been a place like this once, not here, but shaped like here, where children played at echo, and mothers called them home when the shadows began to climb." He said the child had cut his foot on a piece of broken jar at that place and learned the size of a wound is not the measure of its lesson. He learned to look where joy rushes him forward, to ask the ground what it is holding before trusting it with his speed. He stepped into the bowl, and the scholar's mouth opened to caution, then closed. He moved with a care that suggested memory lending ankles its experience. At the bottom, he placed his hand on a stone as if greeting an elder. He looked up at the circle of faces above him, a wreath of concern and curiosity. He said the child had learned another thing that day, a thing that would return later with the force of a river. He learned that those who love you will sometimes look away from your hurt, because to see it is to acknowledge their own helplessness, and helplessness is heavier than stone. The words sat on the heat, like birds on a wire. Precise, balanced, improbable if you considered how young his mouth was. The priest closed his eyes and opened them. The scholar's pen found paper without her looking. The father made a sound not unlike a hinge refusing to rust. The mother pressed her fingers to her bottom lip and felt the steady thrum of her own blood, a reminder that bodies carry drums inside them, keeping time for revelations. Back at the house, the cameraman had made friends with the neighbor who sells cold drinks. He traded sodas for gossip and gossip for a promise of exclusive access, a phrase that makes people stand up straighter or smaller. He prepared words in his mouth like candies, astonishing, unbelievable, shocking, pleased with their brightness and uncaring whether they matched the color of what they described. He did not understand yet that this story resisted adjectives the way a wild animal resists cages. He would learn, or he would leave. The afternoon failed to thunderstorm, though the sky threatened. A yellow light poured over everything, a light that made even rust look merciful. The boy sat cross-legged on the cool tile and lined up bottle caps again, not as currency this time, but as days, arranging them into weeks, into circles of sevens that broke at 9, because childhood does not bargain with calendar logic. He moved one cap apart and said this was the day the traveler had returned. Limp lighter, pouch smaller, songs the same. He hummed the wordless tune until the dog lifted its head and then placed it back down, reassured. The scholar asked the question that had been in the air like a held breath. Had there been anger in those early rooms, the kind that breaks rather than shapes? The boy considered carefully, as if anger might overhear if addressed carelessly and come sit down. He said there had been tempers like summer storms, sudden, loud, the kind that make children stand in doorways watching adults learn their limits. He said remorse came as soon as rain, pattering, washing the grit out of the leaves. He said the child had learned to forgive quickly, not because he was holy, because holding hurt is heavy when you want to run. And he wanted to run. A knock interrupted. Softer than news, harder than neighborly, the man with authority that did not need to announce itself stood at the threshold again, hat in his hand now, the band of sweat replaced by a settled ease. He asked the mother if he might sit a while without asking anything. He said he had been replaying the boy's answer from the previous evening, the one about being expected and the solitude that grows like a second spine under such expectation. He said he had realized the town might be learning an unintended lesson. It might be learning to expect something new from the boy every day, as if the mystery owed them installments. He asked the priest to help break that pattern gently, to teach the town the art of leaving a thing alone long enough to let it breathe. They agreed to try. They would close the house early. They would decline the request from the radio to do a live segment during prime time. They would suggest that neighbors come only on Sundays for a shared hour and let the rest of the week belong to laundry, to the price of onions, to skinned knees and homework. It sounded reasonable. Reasonable is so often where we imagine safety lives. Evening heard their plan and was not impressed. It arrived on its own terms, trailing blue, smelling of matches just struck and water just carried. The boy became heavy-eyed with the unmistakable gravity of sleep. Before the last cliff of wakefulness gave way, he said a line that startled the room into stillness. He said there was a place he needed to show them, but not now, not in Day's language. He said light sometimes blinds a message, the way too much spice distracts from grain. He said they would go when the moon had climbed to the shoulder of the fig tree, when the yard stopped pretending to be ordinary and admitted it was a map. He said there was a name scratched into stone somewhere near, a name that was only visible when the eye allowed darkness to finish the drawing. The scholar and the priest exchanged glances, not of conspiracy, but of readiness. The father rubbed his forearm, an old ache waking at the prospect of night's errands. The mother felt fear arrive, wearing a soft face, not the hard face that demands barricades. This fear asked for a hand to hold. She stood and closed the shutters halfway, making the room its own weather. She touched the boy's hair and found it damp from the day's weight. She hummed without realizing, and the hum bent itself toward a lullaby that had begun walking through her dreams days ago. Outside, the influencer argued with his battery. The neighbor with cold drinks counted coins. The teacher watered a plant that had never asked for care and yet seemed to love it. The dog dozed, with one ear flipped inside out like a flag signaling relaxation. The cistern at the edge of town sat with its stones cooling, a bowl of night waiting to be filled. The moon, elsewhere and above, thought about where its light would land and looked for shoulders. When the hour came, it arrived quietly. A boat bumping a dock in a story you are not sure you are in. The fig tree made its small night music. The mother woke the boy with a touch that told him she was there before the world was. He slid from the sheet and stood, sleep still standing in small puddles around his feet. They stepped outside into the silver that erases edges and gives every object a twin. The priest joined them, a silhouette that left the door ajar as if truth might need a way back in a hurry. The scholar came last, her notebook refusing the invitation, left on the table, a covenant with the decision to witness without recording. They followed the boy to the side of the house where the wall keeps secrets other walls do not wish to carry. He knelt and brushed his fingers over the plaster as if reading Braille written by rain. He moved them slowly, this way and that, patient as a person fishing with a line he fashioned himself. Then he stopped. He whispered, but not to them, to the wall, to the name. He breathed on the spot the way people breathe on glass to coax a fog, and the moon obliged, tilting just enough to lend its angle. Letters rose. Not letters you could photograph and prove, but strokes and curves made of shadow and intention, the suggestion of a name people have feared to say and have needed to say in equal measure. He did not speak it. He touched it, the way you touch a forehead to say, "I recognize you." He said, "This is not a magic trick." He said, "Walls remember hands, and this wall has been teaching itself a language with our passing." He said the child he knew had once traced a name in dust with a finger and watched wind translate it into air, and he laughed then, not from irreverence, from the joy of a name that cannot be trapped. He said this wall wanted a moment of its own. The priest's eyes shone with something that might have been tears or might have been moonlight caught by gratitude. The mother slipped her hand into the father's and felt his answering pressure, a vow to remain, to learn alongside, to not interrupt with fear. The scholar's chest loosened, and a breath she had not realized she was holding climbed out and joined the night where breaths go to finish their work. In the street, a motorbike passed, the rider oblivious to the small ceremony at the wall, to the letters rising like shy fish. The influencer turned over in his borrowed bed and dreamed of numbers climbing. The dog sneezed at a moth. Somewhere, the shallow bowl of the cistern accepted a coin, tossed by a teenager, making a wish that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with the hunger to be seen. The boy stood and placed his palm over the now invisible letters, as if blessing them back into their privacy. He said tomorrow would ask for more than today had given, and he was already tired in the way that children sometimes are, tired not in body, in soul, a word he did not use because it does not belong to his mouth yet. He asked if they could go to the cistern the next day with a piece of bread and a small clay cup. He said he remembered something there that did not fit into sentences without breaking them. He said it softly, like someone telling you the road ahead narrows and you will be fine if you walk single file and keep your hand on the rock. They went back inside, feet learning to be quiet automatically, as if they had been taught by monks. The house received them, walls resettling, chairs remembering their duty to hold. The boy slept fast, the way a candle can go dark suddenly when a window is opened. The mother lay awake, counting the 4 things that kept returning in this story: bread, oil, water, wood, and wondering if faith is simply the bravery of letting simple things teach you again and again. Beyond the shutters, the town rolled to its other side and dreamed of markets under a sky that stays the right amount of blue. Morning would come, and with it visitors eager to hear about a name they could not quite see, and a wound that taught mercy to a boy who would teach mercy to a world. Morning would come with its coffee and its newspapers, and the clever man with the small camera offering to buy the dog for his brand. Morning would come, and the cistern would be there, an open mouth waiting for a drink and a story. But for now, the thin hours held. The moon leaned away, still listening. Somewhere, a traveler with a memory of a limp adjusted his blanket and smiled in his sleep, as if someone he once loved had remembered something correctly. And the remembering had crossed the distance between centuries, like a letter finally finding its address. Dawn unbuttoned itself carefully, as if the day were a shirt borrowed from someone loved and a little too precious to rush. The kitchen woke with soft ceremonies, water finding flame, bread releasing its sleepy sweetness as it warmed, the clay cup cool against the mother's palms, as if it had a memory of riverbed. The boy stirred without fully waking, rolled toward the sound of the world beginning, and surfaced with a long breath that seemed to gather threads from dreams he had not yet let go of. He asked for the bread and the cup without looking at them, the way a person asks for the hand they know is already reaching. The priest arrived in the tended quiet of early morning, hat carried rather than worn, the gesture of someone entering a room where a child is sleeping. The scholar came too, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back with the practicality of someone choosing witness over appearance. The father lifted the small loaf from the cloth, and the cloth kept the shape, a ghost of bread. The boy took the cup, offered it to the mother as if to say, "Carry this with me," and she did, because the body understands before the mind agrees. They walked the road as if remembering it forward, feet rehearsing patience, voices resting. The dog made an inventory of scents and decided to accompany duty with joy, trotting ahead and darting back, weaving a thin thread of levity through the solemn procession. The town watched from porches and thresholds, not pretending not to notice, but deciding together to let silence be the sound of respect. Behind shutters, someone prayed with a voice too small for words. A bicycle leaned against a wall and for once did not fall. At the edge of the settlement where the noise thins and the ground remembers older footsteps, the cistern waited. Stones held the shape of need with the dignity of old work. The boy descended as if entering a memory that did not belong to just one life. The air cooled by degrees, carrying the faint echo of every shout, whisper, and song that had ever practiced itself inside that bowl. He stood at the bottom and looked upward, faces circling the rim like bright coins dropped in a fountain of attention. He lifted the cup and held it to the morning the way children hold a found feather to the light, to let it show the architecture of its miracle. He spoke softly, a tone that carries farther than loudness when a place decides to listen. He said that once, in a yard not far from a house that smelled of wood dust and oil, a child had learned to drink slowly so that water might become instruction rather than relief. He said that long after the lips forgot the temperature, the heart remembered the invitation to pause between sips. He said he wanted them to do that now, to pause long enough for the day to choose them. The mother passed the bread, broke it without ceremony and with tenderness, as if tenderness were its own liturgy. A piece for the priest, a piece for the scholar, a piece for the father, a piece for the boy, and a piece for the earth, which receives all offerings eventually and knows which to keep and which to give back. The boy set the earth's piece on a flat stone, pressed his palm to it, and for a breath seemed to be listening to a reply from below. Then he filled the cup from a plastic bottle the priest had carried, an ordinary water in an ordinary vessel, which is to say exactly the kind of combination that teaches people to pay attention. The first sip went to the mother, because the body that holds the threshold deserves to be the first to cross. The dog looked up, hopeful but not entitled. The boy touched the cup to the rim of the cistern, as if asking the stones to remember their trade. A tiny sound rose, the sound of clay acknowledging stone, of time greeting itself. It is a small music that happens in places where people have tried to survive with dignity. The priest closed his eyes, not to shut out sight, but to open another room inside himself, where sight is slower and less argumentative. The scholar did not write. She stood with her hands open, a stance usually reserved for receiving bad news or rain. The boy told the story of the shard, the cut, the lesson in mercy that had returned in dreams until it had grown a voice of its own. He said the child had bled and had not been consoled by promises that pain passes, because in that moment it did not. He said consolation had arrived instead in the form of presence, the particular chemistry of a mother's quiet and a father's hand hovering unsure and then committing to rest on a shoulder, and of a cousin's clumsy joke that made the wound laugh without forgetting itself. He stepped closer to the wall of the cistern and ran his fingers along the cooler stone where damp clung. He traced a shape that might have been a letter or might have been the path of a tear that had dried and left a geography. He said there had been children here who had made games of echoes, who had discovered the joy of calling their names into the belly of the earth and hearing themselves returned thinner and a little braver. He said the child he remembered had stood where he stood now and felt the loneliness that lives in being seen too clearly, and then heard laughter above, and that loneliness fell apart like old bread brushed by a hand. He turned and extended the cup toward the priest. The priest hesitated because roles and meanings tend to collide at such edges, then accepted because refusing an offered cup is a refusal with velocity, and this was not a day for that. The water tasted like nothing and like relief. He had no language for the way it lifted the clatter inside him and set it down out of hearing. He handed it to the father, whose hands had learned to expect weight and was surprised by how light responsibility could be when spread among many. Then the boy lifted the last piece of bread and held it up as if measuring it against the sky. His voice thinned to a thread that could still tie things together. He said the child had once learned that miracles are not interruptions to the ordinary. They are the ordinary seen without rushing. He said he had learned that the world is full of small resurrections. Wounds knit, bread rises, seeds decide to split themselves open for reasons that can only be called hope. He said he had learned that being expected is different than being loved, and that the way to survive expectation is to keep a small corner of yourself ringed with silence, a sanctuary no one enters without removing their certainty. The influencer, who had trailed them at a respectful distance because even hunger for attention sometimes bows to gravity, lowered his camera. Something in him understood that his lens would change this into something it was not. He sat on a stone and let the scene pass through him unrecorded, which is a kind of recording the heart does when it is allowed to be honest. The boy asked, almost shyly, if anyone had brought a nail. No one had. He smiled at the accident and chose a twig the dog had brought earlier. He wrapped a thread of cloth around one end and pressed the other into the damp mortar between stones, leaving the smallest impression, no letter, not a number, just a dot, the tiniest stake in the ground that says someone was here and chose not to write their name large. He whispered that sometimes the holiest thing you can do is to refuse to carve your initials into what does not belong to you alone. On the walk home, the town felt different, as if a wind had taken a long breath and discovered it could not blow anyone off their path today. The radio man called the house and was told gently that their story had other places to be. The neighbor with the cold drinks gave one to the influencer without asking for payment and did not mention the usual brand in the usual proud voice. The teacher unlocked her classroom, pulled chalk from the tray, and wrote a sentence on the board that had nothing to do with the lesson plan. Sometimes knowing is an act of tenderness. She would erase it before the children arrived, not because it was wrong, because she wanted to carry the sentence inside her until it became her handwriting. The boy was quieter in the hours that followed, not withdrawn, simply tuned to a station beyond talk. He sorted his bottle caps again, but this time he left gaps on purpose and smiled at the spaces. He went to the workshop and lay his cheek on the bench, eyes closed, as if listening for a species of silence that only wood understands. He helped the mother fold towels, the small ones and the large ones, the mundane ministry that households require, and he did not tell any story while he worked, which in its own way told the most important story of the day. He was still a child among tasks, still a boy who preferred ripe figs to metaphor when a plate was placed before him. By late afternoon, the sky had returned to its usual blue, wary of thunder, full of the ordinary mercy of light. The priest wrote a letter to the authority who had come and gone, thanking without promising a resolution. The scholar sat on the step and watched ants conduct their commerce along a crack in the concrete and tried to understand the strange relief of not being required to publish immediately. The father fixed a hinge that had begun to complain again, then tightened a screw that did not need it, an offering to usefulness. The mother took down the cloth from the line and pressed it to her face just long enough to take in the sun it had stolen. The reporter returned with a careful pitch, a promise to let silence speak, a vow to resist the easy arc. The mother listened and believed her and said no anyway. Not a refusal to the woman, a refusal to the machine that demands shape before the soul has chosen its next room. The reporter nodded, surprising herself, and left behind a small box of tea because generosity survives profession. The influencer came by with his camera in his bag and asked if the boy might want to see a new trick with cards. They sat on the stoop and let chance shuffle simple wonder back into the day. Night gathered without incident, which is a kind of miracle we fail to count. The cousin who sang stopped by and did not sing, choosing instead to sit with her chin in her hands and listen to the house breathe. The dog ate and slept with the sigh of a creature content to have participated in history without knowing its name. The boy grew drowsy in the way candles lean toward ending, a soft willingness to become tomorrow's memory in exchange for the right to rest now. Before sleep claimed him, he asked to be carried to the window. The mother lifted him, body knowing the weight even when the mind is elsewhere. He looked out at the fig tree, at its broad leaves holding the moon in pieces. He said a last offering of words, a simple rope thrown across the gap that opens every night between the known and the unknown. He said that the child at the center of his remembering had not been the only one asked to be more than a boy. Every child is asked by the world to be more than they can be, and also fully what they are, and the puzzle breaks some and makes others into bridges. He said if there was a secret not written, it was not a miracle trick or a lost parable. It was this, that love, when it is young and learning, practices on small things so that it can survive the weight of large things later, and that every scraped knee is a rehearsal for forgiving people who cannot see you as small when you need to be. He yawned, the small hinge of the jaw making a click like a tiny latch, and asked a final question that did not request an answer. He asked whether stories choose people because those people have the right rooms inside them, rooms with windows that the wind can find. He asked and then fell asleep before anyone could try to answer, which may have been the kindest way to ask. The house settled. The priest gathered his hat and left the doorjamb with a touch, the way you touch a horse as you pass to tell it you are human and not a storm. The scholar wrote one sentence in her notebook and closed it forever. The father checked the lock twice, and then a third time, because ordinary protections matter even when the extraordinary visits. The mother sat with a cup of the reporter's tea and watched steam rise like a spirit with no agenda. Outside, the town resumed its regular weather of affection and complaint. Someone laughed too hard at a joke that had worked yesterday and would again tomorrow. A light flickered in a window where a couple argued in low voices about bills and then made peace with a shared piece of fruit. Somewhere behind a door that had swollen in the humidity, a man tuned a radio and found a station playing songs from a childhood that had smelled like diesel and hope. The fig tree let go of a single leaf and it spun, a small parachute delivering itself to earth. The leaf landed near the place where the boy had poured oil water earlier, and the ground accepted the landing without comment. Weeks later, the story would have cooled to a warm rock people touch as they pass for luck, for courage, for the pleasure of a familiar temperature. Some would remember the river of dust and the leaf that trusted it. Some would remember the wall that learned to speak when the moon lent it a pencil made of light. Some would remember the taste of water made important by intention. Some would insist it had all been a performance, and they would not be wrong if they meant the performance that life asks of all of us, the carrying of a role with care, the choosing of gestures that do not harm. And years later, because time is not a straight line. It is a thread thrown into a room and then gathered by hands we cannot see. Someone would pass beneath a fig tree in another town, on another continent, and feel suddenly the need to be tender towards something they could not name. They would pause, set down the burden they were carrying, and wipe their thumb across the pad of their other hand, as if remembering a long-ago cut and the lesson that followed it. They would not know why. They would not need to. As for the boy, he would grow the way boys do, in bursts and retreats, in laughter that arrives before reason, and in questions that refuse to wait for permission. The memories would dim the way a path does when grass decides to reclaim it, not disappearing, becoming selective about when it shows itself. He would learn to love the ordinary with the discipline of a monk and the appetite of a child. He would forget to be extraordinary on purpose. Perhaps that is the only way to remain open to the next door that the world, mischievous and tender, might choose to open. Which leaves us, watchers, listeners, those of us who came to the edge of this cistern of a tale, hoping to drop a coin and receive a wish. We stand with the sound of our own breathing loud in our ears and wonder what we have really learned. Maybe only this, that what is not written is not always lost, that some truths decide the safest place to hide is in the mouths of children who have not yet learned to distrust astonishment, that small things, bread, oil, water, wood, remember us better than monuments do. And we are left with a question so gentle, it does not require an answer to do its work. If a child tells you a story shaped like a forgotten room in a sacred house, will you enter with your shoes in your hand, or will you stand at the threshold insisting on proofs while the light fades to a shade you cannot read by? The town turns off its lights one by one. The camera sleeps in its bag. The radio finds static and calls it night. The fig tree keeps watch without asking for thanks. Inside the house of wet clay paint and stubborn screen door, a boy sleeps, a mother breathes, a father dreams of wood forgiving the blade. A dog half chases something holy in its sleep. Somewhere very near and a little far, the stones of the cistern cool and hold the echo of a child's voice saying, not a prophecy, not a reveal, just a promise small enough to be kept. Tomorrow we will practice kindness on the first thing we touch. And the moon, thin and patient, draws a slow river across the ceiling, the kind a child might try to guide with a twig, believing, as children do with a wisdom we forget, that light can be persuaded, that love can learn the path we make for it.